I took a few weeks off in early fall to work on a piece of property my uncle left me when he passed away. It was tucked deep into the northern edge of Montana, up where the trees get tighter and the trails start to feel like veins into a darker place. I'd only been there once before, years back, and even then, just for a day trip. The property wasn't huge, 40 or so acres, but it was surrounded on 3 sides by forest that ran for miles. No neighbors, no fences, not even a proper road, just an old logging path that barely fit my pickup. I'd brought tools, canned food, and some old gear from my army days. The plan was to clean out the old cabin, fix what I could, and get it into shape to use as a hunting camp. My uncle had been a trapper, one of the last who still lived off the land like that, and he'd built the place himself sometime in the late 70s. It had no power, no plumbing, just a wood stove and a hand-pumped well behind the cabin that, to my surprise, still worked. The cabin was rough. Moss was growing on the roof in clumps, and one corner had sagged where the foundation stones had shifted. Inside, the air was stale and thick, like old leather and rodent piss. I cleared out raccoon droppings, swept out rat nests, and burned every mattress and cushion I found. It took 2 full days just to make the main room livable. By the 3rd day, I started hauling out junk from the back room: buckets, traps, wooden boxes full of rusted tools, jars of cloudy preserves, all layered in dust. It was on that 3rd day that I noticed the pit behind the cabin. It wasn't much at first glance, just a shallow depression near the tree line, ringed with smooth river stones. The edges had overgrown a bit, ferns and weeds hanging over it like a curtain, but when I pulled that stuff back, I saw it was deeper than it looked. About 5 feet across, maybe 3 feet deep in the middle. It was lined with stone all the way around, like a dry well. At first, I thought it might have been an old fire pit or garbage hole. I climbed in to clear it out. The bottom was covered in pine needles and loose dirt. I figured if I was going to clean the place properly, I might as well deal with whatever crap had collected in there too. When I started digging through it with my hands, I found bones. At first, I thought nothing of it. Out here, finding bones isn't unusual. A fox or coyote drags something in, maybe a deer dies nearby. There were dozens of little ones, ribs, vertebrae, jawbones, maybe from rabbits or squirrels. Pile of them, really, all jumbled up. They were old and dry, some brittle enough to snap between my fingers. I set a few aside on the stones and kept going. Then I found the shoe. It was small, kid-sized, and so caked in dirt I didn't recognize it at first. I thought it was just a wad of leather or fabric. When I shook the dirt loose, I saw the outline of the sole, the little half-circle toe. The fabric was stiff with age, and one side had come apart at the stitching. It looked like it had been there a long time. I turned it over and noticed something inside. When I tapped it out onto the stones, a piece of bone came with it. A small toe bone. Stopped me cold. I stared at it for a long time, not touching anything. I told myself it could have been a dog's paw bone, something like that. But deep down, I knew better. The size, the shape, it looked human. I sat back on my heels and just stared into the pit. Part of me didn't want to keep looking, but I knew I had to. I went slower after that. I scraped back more dirt, careful now. That's when I found the eyeglasses. They were cracked right down the middle with one lens completely gone. The metal frame was thin, the arms bent and corroded. I picked them up and turned them in my hand. They weren't adult-sized either. I remembered wearing glasses like that when I was a kid, cheap, school-issued kind. My mouth went dry. The air in the pit felt colder, though the sun was still out. I stepped out and sat on the edge for a while. The pine trees stood still around me. No wind, no birdsong, just silence. I thought about heading back to town, maybe calling someone. But who? The sheriff in a place like this would probably be one guy working part-time. And I didn't even know what I had here. Just some old bones, a shoe, and a pair of glasses. I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe someone dumped trash here decades ago. Maybe some kid got lost. I told myself that a lot that evening. I didn't sleep much. I kept looking out the window, half expecting something to be staring back at me from the woods. The next morning, I went back to the pit with a shovel. I worked slowly, methodically. I cleared out the whole bottom, made piles of dirt on one side, bones on the other. There were more of them, some bigger than the others, longer femurs, broader ribs. I couldn't be sure, but they looked like they came from different people. Maybe 3, maybe 4. Some of the bones were burnt, blackened at the ends. One had a hairline crack along the length like it had been struck hard. I stopped counting when I found a second shoe. It was nearly identical to the first, but from a different foot. Also child-sized. I sat down again, covered in sweat, though the air had turned cold. Later that day, I went into the cabin again and started looking at it differently. I wasn't just cleaning anymore. I was searching. I pulled up old floorboards in the back room, checked behind loose boards in the walls. I opened every box, sifted through every jar, every tin. There was a small trunk under one of the cots, rusted shut. I pried it open with a crowbar and found clothes, mostly old flannel, thermal pants, a wool coat with patches. But under those, there was a smaller box, wooden, about the size of a toolbox with a latch that had nearly rusted through. Inside it were scraps of paper. Some were torn from notebooks, others typed or handwritten on yellowing sheets. Receipts, hunting tags, but then I found a map. It was hand-drawn, showing trails around the area, little XS marked along the creeks and ridges. Next to one X was the word school. Another said pickup. A third just said girl. I sat on the floor of the cabin for what felt like hours. I read and reread the words, trying to make sense of them. The papers didn't say anything outright, no confession, no story. But I got the feeling my uncle had kept track of something out here, something he didn't want others to know. I remembered how he'd never married, never had kids, lived alone out here for decades. People always said he was a quiet man, kept to himself, a little odd. I started to feel sick. I left the box where it was and stepped outside again. It was late in the afternoon by then. The woods were starting to darken. I looked back toward the pit and felt my stomach tighten. There were no headstones, no crosses, just the bones and those few items buried in the dirt like trash. I stayed one more night, couldn't sleep. I kept the fire going until morning and sat with my back to the wall, facing the door. My shotgun stayed across my lap, though I wasn't sure what I was afraid of. In the morning, I hiked to the highest ridge I could find and got a signal on my phone. I called the county sheriff's office and told them I'd found human remains on private property. I gave them the GPS coordinates, then hiked back down and waited. They came 2 days later, 2 deputies and a forensic tech from the state. I didn't stick around for all of it. I answered their questions, showed them the pit, the bones, the box I'd found. One of the deputies asked if I'd known my uncle well. I told him no, not really, just that he'd lived alone. They didn't say much to me after that. I got the impression they had their suspicions. I left the next morning and drove straight back to the city. I haven't been back since. A few weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They confirmed that at least some of the remains were human, juvenile, probably under 10 years old. They wouldn't say how many sets they'd found yet. The investigation was ongoing. They asked if I wanted to be notified of any developments. I said no. I sold the property a month later to a forestry company. Took a loss on it, but I didn't care. I didn't want it. I didn't want to know what else might be buried out there. There are nights I still think about that pit, about the eyeglasses, the little shoe, about what kind of man my uncle really was, and what he'd done out there in those woods, and what he thought about when he sat on that porch alone every evening, staring into the trees. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else ever came looking, if they'd known their kid had vanished up in that part of the forest, if anyone had missed them at all. But I don't go looking for answers anymore. I don't think I want to know. I'd never stayed in a hunting cabin before, not really. I grew up around the woods, but not the deep kind, more the patchy kind you find behind suburbs or between highway overpasses. So when I finally took a few days off work and headed north, it was mostly about disconnecting, not some romantic idea of roughing it. I found the place through a forum, not an official rental site or anything, just some guy who posted pictures of an old hunting cabin upstate, way off-grid. Said it was simple but sturdy, had a wood stove, a cot, and a nearby stream. I messaged him, wired a deposit, Got a PDF map in return with GPS coordinates and a handwritten note about where to leave my car and how far the hike in would be. Sounded ideal. Quiet. No reception. No emails. I packed light, mostly dry food, a sleeping bag, small stove, water filter, and my usual hiking gear. I left early, made it to the trailhead by mid-morning, locked my car behind the rickety gate, and started hiking. The trail wasn't exactly well-marked, but I was used to that. It narrowed to a game path after about an hour, winding up a hill and through thick pine. Eventually, the cabin appeared at the top of a ridge, small, dark wood, tin roof, front porch sagging a little. It looked like no one had touched it in years. The door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled like old ash and dust. One room with a small table, an iron stove, a cot against the wall, and a few shelves with mismatched cans. A hatchet was stuck into a stump just outside the door. Windows were cracked open slightly, letting in the cold air and the smell of pine needles. I dropped my pack, rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot, and got the stove going with a little kindling I found in a crate out back. It was quiet enough that I could hear the fire popping, birds calling from deep in the woods, and nothing else. It was perfect. That's when I saw the map. It was nailed to the far wall above the small table, covering maybe a quarter of the wall. A topographic map of the surrounding woods, hand-drawn, not printed. Someone had gone through the effort of sketching out elevations, streams, trails, and even the cabin itself. The edges were curled and yellowed, probably from years of smoke and dust. What caught my eye were the red excess. There were maybe a dozen of them scattered across the map in no clear pattern. Some had little arrows drawn toward them. Some had dates written underneath in faded pencil. The most recent one was right where this cabin sat, and beneath it, in fresh black ink, today's date. I just stared at it. I didn't panic, not right away. My first thought was that maybe the guy who built the map was just keeping track of hunting spots or places he camped. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. But the handwriting was recent. This wasn't some artifact from the 80s. And the ink under today's X wasn't pencil. It looked like someone had marked it in the last day or two. And then I remembered something else. When I got close to the cabin, I'd noticed boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe just old tracks from whoever posted the listing. But now I was less sure. I stepped back outside and took another look. The prints were still there, deeper than mine, heavier tread. They came from the north, straight through the woods. No trail, just bushwhacked in. And I didn't see where they went after. That made my neck tighten up. I walked around the cabin once. No signs of anyone. No gear stashed, no vehicles. Just trees and silence. Still, I kept glancing toward the trees, especially where the trail came in from the north. Felt like someone was still out there. I went back inside, shut the door, and latched it. There was no cell signal. I checked twice just in case. I told myself I was overthinking it, maybe spooking myself because of the isolation. I made a quick dinner, instant rice and tuna, then sat on the porch and ate while watching the tree lean. I didn't see anything, but that night I couldn't sleep. The fire died out early. The stove wasn't great at holding heat, so the cabin got cold fast. I kept waking up, listening. Every creak of the old beams, every rustle outside put me on edge. Around 2 a.m, I thought I heard something brush the wall. Could have been a branch, could have been an animal. But I stayed still for over an hour after that, barely even breathing. By morning, I decided I was going to leave. I packed up before the sun was fully up, rolled my sleeping bag tight, and went outside to relieve myself. And that's when I saw it. There was a second pair of boot prints in the dirt, circling around the side of the cabin. Fresh ones, overlapping mine. They hadn't been there yesterday. I didn't even finish packing. I threw everything in my bag, stuffed the food and gear loose, and didn't bother to clean anything up. I wanted to be gone. But when I stepped off the porch, I looked up toward the tree lean and froze. Someone was standing there, maybe 50 yards away, just between the trees. Dressed in dark clothing, tall, still. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a person watching. No movement, no sounds. Just standing there. I didn't wave. I didn't shout. I didn't do anything. I backed into the cabin, shut the door again, and waited with my pack on. I waited almost 30 minutes. When I finally worked up the nerve to look again, the person was gone. That was enough. I left, took the same trail down, moving fast but quiet. I kept checking behind me, listening. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps matching mine, just out of sync, but it could have been anything, my own paranoia, maybe even an animal. Still, I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I reached the road by early afternoon. My car was still there, locked, untouched. I got in and drove without stopping until I was back in cell range. First thing I did was look up that forum post again, but it was gone. Deleted. No trace of the guy who posted it, no cached version, nothing. Like it never existed. I never reported it. Who would I report it to? There wasn't a crime, technically. No one hurt me. No proof. Just a map with a red X and a date, some footprints, and a guy in the trees. I've thought about it a lot since. Whoever made that map, whoever wrote those dates, they were tracking something. Or someone. And for whatever reason, they marked that cabin for that exact day. Like they expected someone to be there. Maybe they made the post. Maybe they put the ad up to draw someone in. Maybe I was just the latest X. But I didn't sleep right for weeks after that. I still hike, but I stick to the well-known trails now, the ones with people nearby. I don't stay in remote cabins anymore, no matter how cheap they are or how nice the view is. And I've never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. Started out as a solo trip I'd planned months in advance. I was overdue for something quiet, something that would push my legs and lungs and strip my head of all the noise that builds up from living around too many people for too long. I picked a stretch of forest out west. Dense, remote, hard to access except by foot. No trails, no signs, just miles of trees and hills. I parked the truck along a service road, strapped on my pack, and hiked in. The first day went smooth. I followed a ridgeline for a while before dropping into a valley that seemed mostly untouched. I bushwhacked through, using my compass and topographical map to stay on course. My goal was to reach an old fire line by the second night and work my way back along a creek bed over the weekend. I didn't bring a GPS or anything fancy. I wanted distance, both from the city and from all the technology that comes with it. That second night, the rain started. Not hard, just enough to soak my outer layers and make the forest feel smaller, quieter. I pitched my tent on a slope above a runoff ditch and tried to sleep, but something about the silence kept me up. No wind, no distant owls, just the soft patter of rain and the occasional drip of water rolling off pine needles. My sleeping bag felt cold and damp. I kept telling myself I'd feel better in the morning. By the time daylight broke through the clouds, I was miserable and tired. My boots were wet, and my shoulders ached from sleeping curled on one side all night. I ate a cold protein bar and started moving, hoping that walking would warm me up. The rain had stopped, but the forest stayed soaked, and low fog hung in the trees like cotton. I kept moving, checking the map every couple hours. Around mid-afternoon, I found a narrow footpath I hadn't expected. Looked old, overgrown. It wasn't on the map, which made me think it was either animal-made or part of a very old trail network. I hesitated, then followed it. The trail wound east, away from my planned loop. I figured I had enough daylight left to explore a bit and still backtrack if it didn't lead anywhere. After maybe an hour of walking, I started to notice signs. Flat wooden boards nailed to trees, some cracked and moss-covered. Others were cleaner, as if someone had maintained them recently. No words, just slats of wood that seemed to point deeper into the woods. That's when I saw the cabin. It sat low on a slight rise, surrounded by tall pines and a few bare birch trees. It looked like it had been there for decades. Log walls, metal roof rusted to a dull brown, and a small porch sagging on one side. A broken ranger emblem hung above the door, half covered in lichen. There were no other buildings, no vehicles, no sign of activity. Just the structure itself, tucked deep in the woods. I was soaked and tired and starting to feel the weight of being alone. The cabin looked stable enough, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to step inside, warm up, and get out of my wet gear for a bit. The door was unlocked, creaked a little, but it swung open with one slow push. Inside, the place smelled like old pine, dirt, and mildew. Dust hung in the air. The main room had a small cot, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove that had rusted shut. There were shelves along one wall holding canned food so old the labels had peeled off. A pile of firewood sat stacked in the corner, mostly dry. I dropped my pack and checked the corners of the cabin out of habit. Nothing seemed off. No signs anyone had been there recently. No trash, no clothes, no tracks in the thin layer of dust on the floor. That's when I noticed the logbook. It sat on the table, next to a stubby pencil and an old kerosene lantern. The cover was leather, worn and flaking at the edges. I opened it. The first few pages were from the 1960s, mostly short notes from hikers, rangers, and what I assumed were fire crews. Some thanked whoever maintained the place. Others just listed the date and weather. The entries went on for years. Sporadic at first, then steadier through the 1980s. The last regular entry was from 1996. After that, the pages were blank for dozens of sheets. Then, near the very end of the book, a single entry caught my eye. It was dated 1 week ago. It said, "Stayed here overnight. Cold but dry. Something's off. Feels like I'm being watched. Didn't sleep. Leaving at first light." There was no name, just the date and the note, written in tight, uneven handwriting. That stopped me cold. I read it again, then flipped forward. Nothing. The rest of the book was blank. I checked around the room again. Nothing had changed. No recent footprints. No gear. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there in months, maybe years. But that entry was recent. 1 week. And whoever wrote it clearly felt something wasn't right. I told myself it was probably someone like me. Some solo hiker who stumbled across the place and got spooked. Maybe they imagined something out there. Easy to do when you're alone and the forest is quiet and your mind starts running. Still, I kept thinking about that phrase. Feels like I'm being watched. I stayed anyway. I laid out my sleeping pad on the cot and changed into my dry clothes. I boiled some water using my camp stove and made freeze-dried chili. I kept checking the window, even though I couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees through the fog. That night, I bolted the door shut with an old iron latch and wedged a chair under the knob. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something outside. A creak, a snap, maybe just a branch shifting under the weight of moisture. Each time I'd sit up and listen, heart racing. But there was nothing. At some point, I must have passed out. I woke up just after sunrise. Light leaked through the cracks around the window frames. The cabin was cold, but still and quiet. I pulled on my boots, unlatched the door, and stepped out onto the porch. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They circled the cabin single file, pressed deep into the soft dirt and wet leaves. Big, heavy prints made by boots. The tread looked fresh. They wrapped around the cabin again and again, looping tightly like whoever made them had paced around the place for a long time. There were no prints leading to the door. None walking away into the forest. Just the same loop, circling over and over, vanishing a few feet out where the pine needles covered the ground. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anything last night. No knocks, no voices, no footsteps. Just silence. And now, these prints, like someone had spent hours walking around the cabin while I slept. Watching, waiting. I checked my pack. Everything was still there. Nothing had been touched. But my nerves were shot. I kept scanning the trees, expecting someone to step out from the fog. Nothing moved. I packed up fast. Ate nothing. Didn't even change my socks. I just stuffed everything into my bag and left. I didn't follow the old path. I cut straight west, through the thickest parts of the forest, using my compass to guide me back toward the creek. I wanted distance, space. I pushed hard for most of the day, stopping only once to drink from a stream. I didn't see another person the whole way out. That night, I camped on a ridge with a clear line of sight for half a mile in every direction. No trees close to the tent. I kept my knife in my sleeping bag, even though I knew it wouldn't do much against someone who wanted to hurt me bad enough. By the next morning, I was nearly back to the truck. I never reported the cabin, didn't write about it online, didn't tell anyone. I don't know who wrote that last entry. I don't know if they made it out. I don't even know how anyone else found that place. It wasn't on any map, and the trail barely existed. But someone else had been there, and they'd been watching. I've thought about going back once or twice, but the more I think about it, the more I know I won't. Some places are better left where they are. Quiet, hidden, and forgotten. And that old cabin deep in the woods? It's one of them. We had rented the cabin for a week. It was in early October, just when the leaves had started to turn and fall. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. The place was listed as secluded, off-grid, no neighbors within 5 miles. And that was what drew us in. I had been working nonstop, and she'd been juggling her own pile of stress. We both needed something that felt like nothing, just woods, silence, and time. The drive took nearly 5 hours from our place. The last 40 minutes of that were all gravel roads. No signs, no cell service, just a set of written directions we'd printed ahead of time, along with some photos to match landmarks. The cabin was tucked into the edge of a forest clearing, about 50 yards from a shallow creek. Old pines circled most of it, and from the front porch you could see no other homes or structures, just woods sloping down in every direction. It was small but well kept. One main room with a stone fireplace and a couch. A tiny kitchen with a gas stove and a wood table. The bedroom in back was nothing fancy. Just a full-size bed and a dresser that looked a few decades old. No TV, no internet. A battery-powered radio on a shelf by the fridge. There was a generator out back, but we only used it in the evenings to charge our phones or run a space heater. The rental owner had even left us a few bins of firewood on the porch. We arrived on a Saturday around 2 in the afternoon, dropped our bags, and walked around the clearing. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not just quiet in the city sense, but the kind of silence that has weight. Like the woods were waiting for something. That first night, we sat on the porch until it got too cold, then went inside and lit the fireplace. It smoked a little at first, but once the draft caught, it burned clean. We opened a bottle of wine and played cards at the table until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. I slept hard. Sunday morning, we made coffee with a percolator and sat on the porch again. The sun hit the trees just right. It was everything we wanted. We hiked down along the creek for a few miles and then looped back up. Got back around mid-afternoon and made sandwiches for lunch. That night, same routine, fireplace, cards, then bed. It wasn't until Monday that I noticed the first thing. We'd gone hiking again, this time farther west, trying to find an old fire road we saw on a topographic map. We were gone for maybe 6 hours. When we came back, the cabin door was locked, same as we'd left it. Nothing looked broken or out of place. But once we were inside, I went into the bathroom and saw that my toothbrush had moved. It wasn't huge, just off. It had been sitting in a travel cup with hers, bristle side up. Now it was turned around, facing the other direction. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure. Maybe I knocked it when reaching for something, but the feeling stuck. That night, I took a few photos of the bathroom. Toothbrush positions, soap bar, hand towel, even the angle of the shower curtain. I didn't tell her I did this. I just needed to be sure I wasn't going crazy. Tuesday, we stayed closer to the cabin. Did some reading, cooked lunch outside on a little fire pit, and then took a short hike along the ridge to catch the sunset. We were gone less than 2 hours. Came back, door was locked again. The bathroom looked fine at first, but then I opened the photos. The toothbrushes had moved again. Now mine was lying flat across the rim of the cup. Hers was angled in the opposite corner. The soap bar had been rotated. The towel was hanging evenly now, like someone had fixed it. It was subtle. So subtle that it felt worse than if things had been missing. I checked the rest of the cabin. Our bags were untouched. The kitchen was exactly the same. But when I looked at the fireplace, I noticed there were cold ashes in the pit. We hadn't used it the night before, only the space heater. But the ashes were fresh. Not from when we'd used it on Sunday. These were black and loose, not the heavy gray ones we'd left. Still, I told myself maybe it was old. Maybe they just hadn't burned down fully, or maybe a mouse or bird had knocked the grate. But that night, I left a small piece of tape over the inside latch of the back door. Just a little sliver of masking tape, barely visible. It wasn't for security, it was a test. The next morning, the tape was gone. Not torn, not hanging. Gone. I checked the floor, the porch, the trash. Nothing. I still didn't say anything out loud. She hadn't noticed anything off, or if she had, she hadn't said. That day, Wednesday, I kept an eye on everything. We didn't hike, just sat around the cabin, read, napped, did nothing. Every hour or so I checked the tape on the back door and the position of the toothbrushes. No change. Thursday we went into town, about an hour's drive on rough roads. Needed more propane and wanted to pick up some snacks. The town was small, maybe 200 people. One gas station, one general store, one diner. We stayed for lunch and didn't get back until close to 4. When we got in, the cabin felt colder than usual. Not freezing, just like the fire hadn't been lit all day. But the strange part was the radio was on, playing a low buzz of static like it was between stations. Neither of us had touched the radio since arriving. It sat on a shelf, switched off with the dial way past the end of the band. But now it was on and humming, like someone had been trying to find a channel and stopped halfway. I asked if she had used it. She said no. I unplugged it and set it in the closet. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt too sharp. I kept looking at the windows. There were no curtains, just thin shades that barely covered the glass. At one point, I swore I saw a shape move past the edge of the back deck, a quick blur of darker shadow. But when I went out with a flashlight, there was nothing. The next morning, Friday, we talked about leaving early. We had paid for the week, but something didn't feel right. She said she was getting uneasy, said it felt like we weren't alone out here. That sealed it for me. We packed our stuff, loaded the car, and decided to do one last short hike before heading out. Maybe clear our heads. The trail looped around the ridge, only about a mile long. Took us less than 45 minutes. When we came back, I went to do a final walkthrough. That was when I saw the back door was open, just standing there wide open, not kicked in, no damage, but unlocked, unlatched, and open. I knew without a doubt I had locked it. I always double-checked. We both did. I walked inside and did a fast check. Nothing was taken. Nothing looked changed. But the air in the cabin felt wrong, like someone had just stepped out a moment before we arrived. The fireplace had cold ashes in it again, this time with a fresh, half-burned match lying at the edge of the grate. That's when it hit me. Whoever had been inside wasn't trying to steal anything. They were watching, living in the margins of our stay, slipping in when we left, touching things just enough to be noticed. Never loud, never obvious, just small shifts that told us we weren't alone. I didn't check for footprints. I didn't call the sheriff. There was no cell service, and I wasn't going to wait around to see if they came back. We locked up, got in the car, and drove until we hit the main road. It wasn't until we were 2 towns away that I finally felt my shoulders drop. Even now, weeks later, I keep thinking about the little things. The toothbrush, the ashes, the open door, and how long someone must have been watching. How close they had been, every day just waiting for us to leave. Not to rob us, not to hurt us, just to be inside when we weren't. Like they lived there, or thought they did. Like we were the ones intruding. We didn't leave a review, didn't contact the owner, didn't say a word to anyone. We just left it behind. But I still dream about that cabin sometimes. About walking in and finding someone standing in the hallway, holding one of our shirts. About seeing shapes through the thin blinds. About how quiet it was out there, and how easily someone could live just out of sight, slipping in and out, never making a sound, like a shadow with a key. I found the cabin online. It wasn't listed on any of the big rental sites, just a small personal website someone must have made years ago. The layout was bare bones. A single page with a couple of low-resolution photos, a description, and a contact email. But the pictures showed exactly what I was looking for. A small wooden cabin, tucked in the trees at the edge of what looked like a wide ridge. No neighbors, no signs of modern life, no noise. Just a roof, a porch, a chimney, and miles of forest in every direction. I emailed, paid through a basic invoice, got an auto reply with a code for a lockbox, and that was it. The directions were rough. No GPS link, just a few lines that said something like, take Route 16 up past the Fire Tower Trail. Look for a brown sign that says Old Pine Cutoff. Follow the dirt road 2 miles to the fork, bear right at the green post marker, then continue until the gate. I figured that was just part of the charm. Old property, no frills, not modernized. I liked that. I wasn't looking for anything fancy. I wanted quiet, solitude, and a place to think. Maybe hike a bit. I'd had a hard year. Job loss, breakup, a lot of messy thoughts. I needed a clean space to reset. The drive was long. I left early in the morning, and by the time I passed the last gas station, the paved road was already behind me. The 2-lane blacktop turned into gravel, then gravel into dirt, then dirt into something you could barely call a road. Just a pair of faint ruts winding through pine woods and brush. I had to slow down and lean forward over the wheel, scanning the trees for landmarks. Finally, I found the green post. From there, it was just more winding terrain. The track narrowed and sloped slightly uphill, and the trees got denser. Then I saw it, the gate. An old chain link thing, rusted, sitting off to one side, barely closed. It wasn't locked. I got out, dragged it open, then drove through and shut it behind me. The trail kept going another quarter mile until the trees opened up. The cabin sat ahead, tucked in a slight clearing. A small porch, a sagging roofline, some moss growing on the lower logs. Quiet, still, exactly what I wanted. I parked in a flat spot to the left of the cabin where the grass was flattened into the shape of a car. Someone had been here recently, it seemed. I figured maybe the owners used it sometimes, or someone had stayed here before me. I unloaded my backpack and food cooler, unlocked the front door using the code from the email, and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood and dust. Not bad, just unused. The place was simple. One main room with a stone fireplace, a couch, a wood stove, a small kitchen area with an old gas range. A door on the far side led to a single bedroom. No bathroom, just an outhouse behind the place, which I found after poking around outside for a few minutes. The water came from a cistern barrel and a pump spout at the sink, and there was no electricity at all. Again, that was fine with me. I wasn't here to scroll through my phone or work on a laptop. I wanted to be off-grid for a while. The first night was fine, cold but manageable. I got a fire going in the stove and curled up in a sleeping bag on the couch. I read by flashlight for a while, then dozed off to the sound of wind moving through the trees. But the next morning is when things started to feel off. It started when I walked the road again, just wanting to stretch my legs and get a better look at the area. I made it about a mile down the path when I saw it. A small landslide had cut across the road. Not huge, just enough to deposit some boulders, broken branches, and a mound of dirt across the trail. I stepped over it easily, but it struck me as odd, because I didn't remember driving over that. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized it wasn't new. The rocks were settled in place, weeds growing through the dirt. It hadn't happened yesterday or even last week. This was old, months, maybe years old. So how had I gotten up here? I walked back to the cabin, slower this time, studying the track beneath my boots. It was narrow, much narrower than a car would normally use. The tire ruts were shallow and dry. I squatted down and touched the dirt. No recent tracks, no fresh compression. It looked like no one had driven it in a long time. But my rental car was parked just 20 feet from the cabin. I had driven here. I remembered every turn, every bump, but the ground said otherwise. Back inside, I opened the window and just stared out at the car. It sat there like it always had. Same angle, same spot. The tires were clean. I walked out to it, checked the tread. No mud, no gravel wedged into the grooves. The license plate was dusty. It looked like it had been there for days, but I just parked it the day before. I spent the rest of the day hiking around, trying to distract myself. I followed a trail down the ridge and found a small stream. The woods were thick with pine and fir, and the underbrush was low. Nothing felt dangerous, just quiet, but I kept circling back to that road in my head. How had I gotten here if the road was blocked? Was there another way in? I hadn't seen any side paths. Maybe I'd driven over the slide and not realized it? But no, that didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking I heard sounds outside. Not animals, just movement. A dry crunch like leaves underfoot. A metallic clink. I got up twice to look outside, sweeping the trees with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The car never moved. Nothing did. By morning, I knew I needed to leave. Something felt wrong. I didn't believe in anything supernatural, but I trusted my instincts. The forest felt still in the wrong way, like it was holding its breath. I packed up fast. My bag, my cooler, everything back into the car. I turned the key. Nothing. The dash didn't light up. Dead. I checked the dome light, didn't turn on. I popped the hood, looked at the battery cables. No corrosion. No obvious problem. But the engine wouldn't turn over. Just silence. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring out the windshield. There was nothing nearby. No signal. No other cabins. No road crews. I'd passed one house maybe 10 miles back near the fork. That was my only shot. I got my backpack, packed a few things, and started walking. I passed the rock slide again. Looked at it harder this time. The boulders were big, one was the size of a small desk. No way I could have driven over them, not in the compact rental I had. There were no tire tracks, no scrape marks. It didn't make sense. It really didn't. When I finally made it down to where I remembered seeing that house, it was gone. Just a foundation half covered in ivy, rotten wood, no roof, no sign of life. I stood there, staring at it, heart pounding. I was sure it had been there. I remembered seeing smoke from a chimney, a bird feeder swinging in the wind, but now just ruin. I turned back, climbed uphill again, legs aching. I reached the cabin around sunset. The car sat where I left it, unchanged. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. I kept my hiking knife nearby. I had no real reason to, but it felt right. The next few days blurred together. I tried everything. Cleaned battery contacts, siphoned water to cool the engine, even tried jump-starting the car with a spare solar battery pack I used for charging flashlights. Nothing worked. I rationed food. I kept walking parts of the trail every morning, hoping maybe I'd find a spot with signal or another way out. But there was nothing, just thick trees and hills in every direction. Then one morning I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. Too big, too far apart. Deep in the dirt like someone heavy had walked through. They were fresh. I followed them, only a few yards before they veered off into the brush. I called out once without thinking, then stopped myself. I wasn't supposed to talk to anyone. There wasn't supposed to be anyone up here, but someone had walked through. Recently, that night I didn't sleep. I left the flashlight on, battery be damned. I stayed on the couch with my back to the wall and waited for morning. The next day, I made a decision. I packed everything I could carry and left on foot. I didn't know where I was going, but I wasn't staying. I followed the trail until my legs gave out, slept in the open, then walked again. On the third day, I found a highway, a state road with actual traffic. I flagged down a car and made it to a gas station. They called the sheriff for me. I explained everything, the cabin, the dead car, the strange footprints, the blocked road. He listened, then nodded slowly and said something I didn't expect. That cabin's land was condemned. There was a big rock slide 5 years ago, cut off access. The Forest Service tried to block it off, but sometimes hikers still wandered up. But no cars had made it through since. The trail wasn't drivable. Too narrow, too damaged. I asked about the rental listing. He looked confused, said the place wasn't legally on the market. The owner had died a decade ago. No family. He drove me up to the access road a few days later, after arranging